With the 2024 college football regular season concluded, there's been a lot of talk about strength of schedule, who has the hardest schedule, which for those wondering was the Georgia Bulldogs, who had to take on Clemson, Alabama, Texas twice, Ole Miss, and Tennessee, with only one of those being a home game, which was Tennessee. But historically, the #1 toughest schedule is a badge, not necessarily of honor, but given to a team who got absolutely throttled in the regular season to look back on and go, yeah, that was a tough one. But there was one time a team went on the gauntlet of ages. I'm talking about the 3 hardest year run for strength of schedule of all time and absolutely demolished it. And I'm talking about 2014 through 2016 Alabama Crimson Tide. Now before I dive in, the #1 strength of schedule, as I like to allude to, was a little bit different back in the day. It really used to not be something you'd walk out of. In the 10 years leading up to this game, the teams that had the hardest strength of schedule went like this. And as a quick side note, I'm not using ESPN's data on strength of schedule. Instead, I'm using the strength of schedule calculator according to the Sagarin formula, which works to remove bias from rankings as well as taking into account the location of the game. But 2005, the Oklahoma Sooners had a gauntlet containing TCU, who was unranked when they played but ended a 1-loss team, a road trip to UCLA, who turned out to be a 2-loss team on the season, then going to #2 Texas and playing a top 25 Texas Tech team where they'd come out of the gauntlet 7-4. 2006 featured Stanford, who would just be a whipping boy for an incredibly strong Pac-12, having to play against Oregon, Notre Dame, Cal, USC, heck, even a pretty solid Wazoo team that year as they limped out of their season 1-11. 2007, UCLA was on the receiving end of that nightmare gauntlet, coming out 6-6 after having to take on Arizona State, USC, Oregon, and USC as their final 3 games of the season, who were all highly ranked. 2008, the Huskies got that schedule and got steamrolled to 0-12, while 2009, the SEC was on the uptick as the hardest schedule went to Mississippi State, who was able to sneak out 5 wins between taking on a ranked LSU, Georgia Tech, #1 Florida, #2 Alabama, and #25 Ole Miss. 2010, this goes back to the pack with Oregon State getting just trounced by a top 10 TCU, top 5 Boise State, top 10 Arizona, and having to go on their final 3 games and take on top 20 USC, #7 Stanford, and a rivalry game for dessert of a #1 Oregon, finishing 5-7. Now bear with me, we have just a couple more. I just really want to paint this picture for you guys. 2011, Kansas had to bear the cross with a powerful Big 12 conference, and my God, got smacked around going 2-10. 2012, that award went to Missouri, who got their welcome to the SEC moment by having to take on every single top 10 SEC team in 1 year, going 5-7 while losing to #7 Georgia, #7 South Carolina, #1 Alabama, #8 Florida, and ending their season against the Johnny Football-led Aggies team. But coming into 2013, the calm before the storm, it goes back to Stanford, who was ready to step up to the plate this time, where for the first time in forever made it to their conference championship after an absolute gauntlet with an 11-2 record. But on average, up to this point, teams who had played against this tough of a schedule went a collective 44-66 against the #1 schedule in the country by this metric. And coming into 2014, Alabama had, well, the second hardest schedule, but we'll get into why that doesn't matter as much in a bit. But before this, Saban had been dominating, but there was kind of this feeling like sometimes Alabama had a little bit of a cupcake schedule. Since Saban had been there, they had a top 5 strength of schedule only once in 2009, where yes, they dominated it and went on to win the national championship without dropping a single game with the second hardest schedule. But since then, they had been coasting and they hadn't had a top 10 schedule. And even in 2013, they were ranked all the way down at 39, where they still finished just 11-2. But this year, man, this year was loaded. They opened up their season against an unranked West Virginia team who they beat handily by 9 points before getting a nice home opener against FAU, beating Southern Miss, and Florida before it began. The gauntlet. They go to a #11 Ole Miss and drop their one and only game by 4 points to a strong Rebel team before taking on Arkansas at their house and immediately having a scorching hot Texas A&M team come back to Tuscaloosa where they would put out that fire. They then had 2 back-to-back away games at Tennessee, who they're able to knock off before taking on #16 LSU down in the Bayou, where after a hard-fought game took them to overtime and beat them there, having to come home and take on the hottest hottest team in the country in a #1 ranked Mississippi State, where they fought and clawed out a 5-point victory before their first real reprieve in 6 weeks, where they got to take on Western Carolina. They then had Auburn come into their house, where they had to survive an offensive onslaught in the Iron Bowl, where they took this game to a 99 total point shootout between the two teams before having to go to the championship game where they would knock off number 16 Missouri, which they did, leaving the season not just as SEC champions, but the #1 team in the country, where they limped into the first playoff game in college football history to take on Ohio State, who in the back half of their season had to only take on a top 10 Michigan State, top 25 Minnesota, but also got a pretty weak Indiana and Michigan before getting to coast past Wisconsin, where they would knock off Alabama in the playoffs. But 2014, 6 top 25 teams, 4 in the top 15, and having to take on the #1 team in the country, and only one team had a tougher schedule than that, and this is why I consider this to be an honorable #1, and it's because it was Auburn, who had on average a weaker schedule with one exception. They had to play Alabama at Alabama, giving them the edge over Alabama. But 2015 would be even harder. They open up with their out-of-conference game against number 20 Wisconsin before dropping a game once again to 15 Ole Miss. But from here on out, that rocky road was about to get steamrolled. They walked into a number 8 ranked Georgia's house and knocked them down with a 4-touchdown lead, where 2 weeks later they go to College Station to take on number 9 Texas A&M and brutalize them with a final score of 41-23. 2 weeks after that, they had number 2 LSU come to their house, where they received the same treatment as they beat them by 2 touchdowns before immediately turning around and having to go to number 17 Mississippi State to simply shove their head in a toilet for 4 quarters before handily winning the conference championship by nearly doubling Florida's score. And it didn't end there. Not only would they win their conference championship, but would go on to the playoffs and completely destroy Michigan State 38-0 before taking on one of the strongest teams in the country in Clemson. And this was after an unfathomable grind of a season, averaging playing a top 25 team every other game. They were able to knock them off 45-40, making this team the first team, at least back to 1998, but maybe ever, who had the hardest schedule and still won a national championship. But remember, this stretch lasted 3 years, which brings us to 2016, where they would have to run it back one more time. They opened number 20 USC, where they immediately knocked them down a peg with a 46-point victory. Then 2 weeks after that, they were able to extract their revenge against number 19 Ole Miss as they snuck out a 5-point win at Ole Miss, where 3 weeks after that, the craziest grind of this 3-season stretch was about to start. It starts by going to number 16 Arkansas, where they would dismantle them with a 19-point win. Turn around and go to number 9 Tennessee, where they would prove a point with a 39-point slaughtering of the Tennessee team, who was only volunteering to go back to the locker room by the end of this game, before having to take on number 6 Texas A&M in Tuscaloosa, where they'd get dismantled by 19 points, where they would turn around and have to travel to the Bayou to take on number 13 ranked LSU, where it wasn't pretty, but they got the 10-0 win. Their slight reprieve came against Mississippi State and Chattanooga, before they would have to take on 2 back-to-back top 15 teams in Auburn and Florida. And if you combined Auburn and Florida's total scores from those 2 games, it still wouldn't have beaten Alabama's score in either of those games. And once again, they would have to leave this brutal schedule, a schedule where they played more top 20 teams than not, and limp into this postseason. That limp, however, did not stop them from whooping Washington, as they had to now face down a Clemson who, in arguably one of the greatest national championship games of all time, was able to sneak out a 4-point win thanks to a last-minute touchdown by Hunter Renfrow, and arguably one of the greatest surprise onsides of all time to never give Alabama a chance at winning this game. But those 3 regular seasons with the number 2, number 1, and number 1 hardest schedules, and they walked away with only 2 losses, both ironically to Ole Miss. But we're talking about a feat that has never been done up to this point, which is losing only 1 game with the hardest schedule of the year and doing it 3 times in the row, with 1 year going on to win the national championship and the next going completely undefeated with the hardest schedule in the nation. And that is an act that pure statistically will probably never happen again, as it's very rare to see teams get scheduled this difficult 3 times in a row. But also, with a new landscape of rent-a-players and mercenary armies, we're probably never going to see a team this good 3 years in a row ever again. And the only thing more impressive, the thing that makes this so much better, is that during these 3 years, it's not like Alabama was sneaking under the radar of these teams. because every single year they were the team to beat, meaning that these top 15 teams that they'd play, all of which looking for a marquee win to get their season legitimized, had Alabama circled every single time and always came up short, which is why I think this is the greatest 3-year run in college football history.
Alabama back on top.